Let me tell you something that most people are completely missing about what just happened in Brazil. When you see headlines about BRICS nations launching payment systems or de-dollarization initiatives, the natural reaction is to file it under emerging markets doing emerging market things. It sounds important in theory, but in practice, these announcements come and go without fundamentally changing how global finance actually works. Except this time is different. This time, Brazil didn't just announce another alternative payment platform. Brazil activated something that has been sitting dormant in the architecture of global finance for decades, waiting for exactly the right combination of conditions to become dangerous, and those conditions just aligned. Here's what actually happened. On March 27, 2026, the Central Bank of Brazil formally integrated its instant payment system, called Pix, with Russia's SPFS network and China's CIPS clearing platform. Now, if you're not deeply familiar with financial plumbing, that sentence probably sounds technical and boring. But let me walk you through exactly why this matters so much. Pix is not some experimental fintech project. It's the dominant payment infrastructure in Brazil, processing over 8 billion transactions per month with 145 million active users. That's more transaction volume than Visa and MasterCard combined in Latin America's largest economy. And Brazil just connected this system directly to the payment networks that Russia and China built specifically to operate outside the dollar-based financial architecture controlled by Western institutions. The moment this integration went live, something became possible that was structurally impossible before. A Brazilian company can now pay a Chinese supplier in yuan, and that Chinese supplier can pay a Russian energy provider in rubles, and that Russian provider can pay a Brazilian agricultural exporter in reais, and the entire transaction chain never touches the dollar, not once, not even as an intermediary settlement currency. The loop closes without ever entering the SWIFT network, without ever clearing through New York, without ever giving the U.S. Treasury Department visibility into the transaction, let alone veto power over it. Think about what that means for a second. For 70 years, the U.S. dollar has functioned as the mandatory intermediary in global trade. If South Korea wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, both countries converted their currencies into dollars for the transaction, even though neither country is the United States. This structural requirement created automatic demand for dollars that had nothing to do with actual American economic activity. That demand is what allows the United States to run trillion-dollar deficits while maintaining currency stability, to borrow at rates that should be impossible given its debt levels, and to weaponize financial access as a foreign policy tool. The entire architecture of American power in the 21st century rests on this foundation, and Brazil just demonstrated that the foundation has a trapdoor. To understand why this trapdoor exists and why it's opening now rather than a decade ago or a decade from future, you have to think about what economists call network effects in payment systems. This is the framework that makes sense of what's happening. Network effects mean that the value of a payment network increases exponentially, not linearly, with each new participant. A payment system with 10 users is not twice as valuable as one with 5 users. It's exponentially more valuable because the number of possible connections increases geometrically. This is why Facebook dominated social media and why SWIFT dominated international finance. Once a network achieves critical mass, the switching costs become prohibitive and the network becomes self-reinforcing. For decades, this network effect protected dollar dominance even as American economic share of global GDP steadily declined. Sure, China became the world's largest trading nation. Yes, the Eurozone represented an economy comparable in size to the United States. Absolutely, emerging markets grew faster and contributed more to global growth than developed economies. But none of that mattered for currency dominance because the transaction networks all ran through dollar-denominated infrastructure. The network effect locked everyone into the existing system, regardless of their individual preferences. But here's where the framework reveals something that most conventional analysis misses entirely. Network effects work in reverse. Once a network reaches a tipping point where critical mass shifts to an alternative platform, the exodus accelerates. The same exponential mathematics that made the network impossible to challenge suddenly makes it impossible to defend. Think about what happened to MySpace when Facebook reached critical mass, or what happened to BlackBerry when iPhone reached critical mass, or what happened to Blockbuster when streaming reached critical mass. The decline wasn't gradual and manageable. It was sudden and catastrophic because the network effects that had protected accelerated market dominance, reversed direction, and accelerated collapse. Now apply that framework to what Brazil just did. Brazil is not some minor economy experimenting with alternative systems. Brazil is the 9th largest economy in the world, the largest economy in Latin America, the dominant agricultural exporter in global markets, and a critical node in South-South trade networks. When Brazil's payment infrastructure integrates with Chinese and Russian systems, it doesn't just add one more participant to an alternative network. It adds 215 million people, $1 trillion in GDP, and the transaction flows of the world's largest exporter of soybeans, coffee, sugar, orange juice, and beef. More importantly, it adds legitimacy and proof of concept. Here's why that matters. Every finance minister in every emerging market has spent the last 5 years having the exact same internal conversation. They've watched Russia get cut off from SWIFT. They've watched the United States freeze Afghan central bank reserves. They've watched secondary sanctions threaten any bank that processes payments for Iranian oil or Venezuelan exports. And they've all asked themselves the same question: what happens if we're next? What happens if our foreign policy priorities diverge from Washington's and we suddenly find ourselves locked out of the financial infrastructure that our entire economy depends on? Until now, the answer was, there's no alternative, so we have to accept the risk. But Brazil just changed that answer. Brazil demonstrated that a major economy can integrate with alternative payment systems, maintain full functionality in international trade, and do so without economic catastrophe or financial isolation. The proof of concept is no longer theoretical, it's operational. And once one major economy demonstrates that departure is possible, the calculation changes for every other economy that's been quietly hedging against dollar dependence. Let me show you exactly how this network effect reversal accelerates. Indonesia has been developing digital payment integration with China for 3 years. The moment Brazil's system goes operational without major disruption, Indonesia's timeline compresses. Why would Indonesian policymakers wait another 2 years to implement something Brazil just proved works? India's UPI system processes 12 billion transactions per month. India has been conducting bilateral trade with Russia in rupees since 2022. The technical infrastructure to integrate UPI with SIPs and SPFS already exists. The only barrier was first-mover risk. Brazil just eliminated that barrier. Now add Turkey, which has been operating under intermittent sanctions threats for a decade. Add South Africa, which is already a BRICS member and processes significant trade with China. Add Argentina, which shares a border with Brazil and conducts 35% of its trade within South America. Add Saudi Arabia, which has been accepting yuan for oil payments since 2023 and has watched its strategic relationship with the United States deteriorate. Add the UAE, which has positioned itself as a neutral financial hub and has every incentive to offer access to alternative payment rails. Each integration makes the next integration easier and more attractive. The network effects that protected dollar dominance begin operating in reverse. And here's the critical part. This reversal doesn't require any of these countries to actively oppose the United States or deliberately undermine the dollar. They're just making rational decisions to reduce systemic risk in their own financial infrastructure. But the aggregate effect of rational individual decisions becomes a systemic transformation that nobody planned and nobody can control. Let me walk you through a concrete scenario so you can see how this plays out in practice. Imagine a Vietnamese textile manufacturer that exports finished garments to Brazilian retailers. Under the current system, the transaction works like this. The Brazilian retailer's bank converts reais to dollars, sends dollars through SWIFT to an intermediary bank in New York. That bank converts dollars to dong and sends the payment through another SWIFT message to the Vietnamese manufacturer's bank in Hanoi. The entire chain requires dollar liquidity, SWIFT access, correspondent banking relationships, and compliance with U.S. sanctions screening. The transaction takes 3 to 5 business days and costs roughly 3% in fees and foreign exchange spreads. Now imagine the same transaction after Pix integration with alternative networks. The Brazilian retailer initiates a payment in reais through Pix. That payment routes through the integrated network to the Vietnamese manufacturer's bank in dong. Settlement happens in hours rather than days. Transaction costs drop to 0, 5%, because there's no dollar conversion and no correspondent banking fees. And critically, there's no exposure to sanctions risk, SWIFT disruption, or dollar liquidity crunches. Which system would the Vietnamese manufacturer prefer? Which system would the Brazilian retailer prefer? The answer is obvious. Neither company cares about geopolitics or currency dominance or American foreign policy. They care about cost, speed, and reliability. And the alternative network is superior on all three metrics for this transaction. Now multiply that scenario across millions of transactions, thousands of companies, and dozens of countries. The migration away from dollar-denominated infrastructure doesn't require any grand conspiracy or coordinated attack on American power. It just requires individual economic actors making rational decisions about cost and risk. The network effect reversal happens organically, driven by the same market forces that created dollar dominance in the first place. But here's what makes this particularly dangerous for the United States. The dollar's role in global finance creates what economists call exorbitant privilege. Because foreign central banks and corporations need to hold dollars for trade settlement, they buy U.S. Treasury bonds as a store of value. That demand for treasuries allows the U.S. government to borrow at artificially low interest rates. Those low rates enable deficit spending that would be unsustainable for any country without reserve currency status. That deficit spending funds everything from Social Security to defense budgets to infrastructure investment. Currently, foreign entities hold approximately $6 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. China holds $850 billion. Japan holds $1 trillion. OPEC nations hold $340 billion. If demand for treasuries declines because fewer countries need dollar reserves for trade settlement, what happens to U.S. borrowing costs? Even a modest increase in treasury yields has catastrophic fiscal implications. The U.S. government pays roughly $900 billion per year in interest on $34 trillion in federal debt at current rates. If yields increase by just 2 percentage points across the curve, that annual interest expense rises to approximately $6 trillion. That's more than the entire defense budget. That's more than Social Security. And that increase comes from declining foreign demand that has nothing to do with domestic U.S. economic policy. Now add to this something that makes the Brazil situation particularly significant. Brazil didn't activate this integration in isolation. Brazil coordinated the announcement with the BRICS summit schedule and integrated the launch with China's digital yuan pilot expansion and Russia's SPFS network upgrade. The timing isn't coincidental. The coordination signals that this is the beginning of a rollout sequence, not a standalone experiment. If you talk to serious monetary economists, they'll tell you that the real test comes when the alternative network has to handle crisis conditions. SWIFT and the dollar-based system have survived multiple global financial crises, sovereign defaults, and banking system collapses. The infrastructure proved resilient under extreme stress. The alternative networks haven't faced that test yet. But here's the thing. They don't need to be superior during crisis conditions to erode dollar dominance. They just need to be adequate during normal conditions. Because once transaction flows shift to alternative rails during normal times, the reserve demand for dollars declines regardless of crisis performance. Think about what happens when Saudi Arabia announces integration next quarter. Saudi Arabia exports $350 billion annually in oil and petrochemicals. If even 20% of those transactions shift to alternative payment networks, that's $70 billion in annual trade that no longer generates dollar demand. If Indonesia integrates, that's another $240 billion in annual trade. If India integrates, the numbers become staggering. India conducts $2 trillion in annual trade. Even partial migration to alternative networks represents hundreds of billions in reduced dollar demand. These trends aren't happening in separate boxes. They interact. Economic competition generates political tension. Political tension makes economic cooperation harder. Harder cooperation makes financial decoupling more likely. Financial decoupling increases debt pressure. Increased debt pressure reduces flexibility. The cycle reinforces itself. And unlike military competition, where the United States maintains overwhelming conventional superiority, or technological competition, where American innovation ecosystems still lead, financial competition operates in an arena where network effects determine outcomes more than state capacity. The United States cannot simply prevent countries from building alternative payment systems. It cannot bomb data centers or blockade fiber optic cables or invade countries to force them back onto SWIFT. The tools that project American power in other domains are mostly useless in the domain of financial infrastructure. The only real leverage is the existing network effect, and Brazil just demonstrated that the network effect is reversible. Now zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture. What you see is not a chaotic or unpredictable situation. What you see is a very deliberate trap, a trap built not through active conspiracy, but through patient observation of structural vulnerabilities in the system that has organized global finance since 1944. The United States built its post-war dominance on the Bretton Woods system, which collapsed in 1971. It rebuilt that dominance on the petrodollar system, which required Saudi Arabia and OPEC to denominate oil sales in dollars. That system held for 50 years because there was no alternative and because the transaction costs of building an alternative exceeded the benefits of independence. But technology changed the equation. Digital payment systems, instant settlement, and distributed clearing infrastructure reduced the cost of building alternative networks by orders of magnitude. What would have required decades of infrastructure investment in the 1990s can now be deployed in months. And what would have required massive coordination among hundreds of central banks and thousands of commercial banks can now be accomplished through software integration among a handful of key nodes. Brazil didn't start this process. China started building CIPS in 2015. Russia started building SPFS after Crimea in 2014. India started building UPI in 2016. But Brazil is the first major economy outside the core alternative bloc to fully integrate with those systems. That integration is the signal every other finance minister in every other emerging market has been waiting for. It says, this is real, this works, and the risk of departure is lower than the risk of dependence. The real question is not whether the dollar will maintain its reserve status indefinitely. The real question is how rapidly the transition accelerates, and whether that acceleration is gradual enough for the US economy to adjust or abrupt enough to trigger systemic crisis. Because the United States has structured its entire fiscal position around the assumption of continued reserve currency demand. The federal government's ability to run sustained deficits depends on foreign willingness to hold treasury securities. The military's ability to maintain global presence depends on deficit-financed defense spending. The economy's ability to absorb trade deficits depends on dollar demand that has nothing to do with American exports. Remove the foundation, and everything built on top of it has to restructure. The restructuring process is not smooth or painless. It involves fiscal austerity, currency depreciation, import compression, and the kind of economic adjustment that generates political instability. And it happens not because of conscious policy choice, but because the market forces that sustained the old equilibrium shifted to a new equilibrium that nobody designed and nobody controls. So when you hear the next announcement about another emerging market integrating with alternative payment networks, try holding all of these things together in the same frame. The technical integration, the network effect mathematics, the declining reserve demand, the fiscal pressure on U.S. government borrowing, the political impossibility of the spending cuts that would be required to adjust, because they're not separate stories, they're different angles on the same story. And that story is about what happens when the structural foundation of a global system erodes faster than the system built on top of it can adapt. Empires do not fall overnight, they erode. And right now, the conditions for that erosion are assembling with remarkable speed.